Hey, I think that's how I start every single recording. Hi, everybody. I know it's been a while since I've been around. I got like 6 concurrent projects, not to mention full-time consultation. Um, anyway, I don't know if everyone has caught up on recent publications from the Open Source Cowboy uh, at the merch. But essentially, I've been doubling down on what it means for open source sustainability in Web3 environments. We pioneered a lot of the concepts in Cardano, and through those efforts, I've met with people from other ecosystems, Ethereum, Hedera, um, Web2 experts, and different places all over. And then just with my governance consultation, I've done a lot of consulting work and seen a lot of different environments and how they're all trying to tackle similar issues. And that made me, especially with the relevance in Cardano and the limitations with the certain structures and things that are in place, made me come up with a new concept, if you will, on for how open source sustainability can be managed and the unique variables in Web3 and how we can handle such situations. Um, so I wanted to unveil the new initiatives that we have going on. Um, then, yeah, so I'll go ahead and get started on that. So I am curating what I'm. Am I lagging? Yeah, I am. And I'm on the wrong thing. Okay, so here we go. So I am curating a new concept of what I'm calling a decentralized OSPO, building on the Web3 aspect for a Web2 structure. And yeah, this is our journey for that. For those who are watching this, this is part of a presentation I'm giving at the virtual OSPO event, trying to bring more awareness for this. Now, I primarily am a consultant slash co-founder for Open Source Cowboy Consulting, but with this open source sustainability initiative and the partners that I've built a relationship with, we started something called the Open Source Frontiers Lab under the Linux Foundation Decentralized Trust. And I'll get more into that, but the idea is building a neutral framework to that ecosystems can come to, work within that labs and pull out what they need for helping their advance their mission for open source infrastructure. I really want to pinpoint and build a reference architecture and even operational frameworks that people can just take and deploy, and know that there's a level of success behind all these, and it's not just the Robin Hood and the Merry Band trying to do stuff, but that we actually have a coordinated approach and lessons learned, best practices from everyone. I want to create a to-do group, essentially, or at least a framework for it, for how OSPOs were coordinated and how that group is utilized, but for Web3 and our unique infrastructure when it comes to sustaining open source. So for us to get started, I think it's really important to understand the fundamentals of open source projects. For those unfamiliar with it, open source projects have a myriad of needs, covering from licensing, governance, the contribution, maintenance, and specifically also sustainability as being the hot topic lately, even in the Web2 space, because GitHub just did their open source security fund to help get best practices associated with that and compensate people for taking steps towards that. Germany is taking open source as public infrastructure and started the Sovereign Tech Agency. And we also have the Open Source Endowment Fund, which actually just landed a public charity status in the US, which officially kind of marks governments acknowledging that open source software is a charity in a way, or equal to it in the sense of how it can be stewarded and taken care of. So major shout out to them. But the key takeaway to understand here is projects, even though you just put software on GitHub and you may be a consumer of that software, the software that you are utilizing has these different needs. And projects have life cycles and need active maintenance, the way that licensing works for how it's utilized is the basic thing. How does the project evolve? What's the decision-making structures? How do you manage community participation? That hits the governance contribution. And then making sure that something isn't hacked, is alive, making sure projects are up to date, your maintenance. And then towards all of these other initiatives, how is it being sustained? The people working on this, are they corporate salaries? Is it a grant project? What happens when the funding runs out? How do you ensure that life cycle, like long-term viability for these things? And people contributing to the project. Um, so these are all critical things that people need to understand for any of this topic for what I'm about to speak to make sense. And for those who are not familiar with the difference between what Web 2 and Web 3 is, Web 2 is very much about reading and writing when it came to the development of the internet. And Web 3 is the evolution of that in the sense that you can actually own the data being worked on. Now, taking a step back, what I'm trying to get here for context is open source is public infrastructure. I think it's either 90 or 95% of all Fortune 500 companies actually use open source software in their bill of materials. And that different structures came about to take care of open source, especially in the traditional software environment, where OSPOs or open source program offices are founded inside companies to manage compliance, licensing, and contribution policies for how corporations interact with consuming and both contributing back to different software. And then you have foundations. Linux and Apache are probably some of the most prominent foundations for this, where the Linux kernel actually is an open source project that is used in most software nowadays. And the Linux Foundation became an umbrella organization for that, to take care of that kernel, but it evolved into so many different things with like the Linux Foundation Decentralized Trust, trying to bring together structure for open source Web3 projects. Um, and typically, paid maintainers are supported by corporate sponsors. Open source health is tracked via projects like Chaos Community with Grimoire Labs, LFX, and integrated build off of that for the Linux Foundation for their projects. And governance is mostly internal boards and working groups, but there's a structure to sustain this. Now, the Web3 angle and what this transfers is actually the infrastructure is the product. There is no variation because we're talking about digital technology that powers a currency of a digital nation. So what we mean by on-chain is decisions are reflected and put on immutable records on this ledger database that can't be hardly tampered with. And that's where Web3 is different because this is public data. Maintainers are typically funded by token holders. So whatever currency is in flow in Web3, that's typically used to also pay people. There's taxes. So maybe it's better I help explain the Web3 side of it, is that Web3 are digital nations, literally. And comparatively, using the US as an example, you have the US Treasury that manages monetary policy, and then you have three branches of government. Now, I use Cardano a lot in this context because Cardano set up a liquid democracy model where if you hold a US dollar, you are a citizen of this, or if you hold an token ADA similar to US dollar, you are a citizen of that country and can vote. And there's an executive branch, a legislative branch, and a judicial branch of sorts that all manage the monetary policy, the building, and the ecosystem as a whole. So when we're talking governance, it's a whole different level of maturity for this, and it's a permissionless environment. So there's a lot of different complexities and nuances. It's not just we built software and we open sourced it and we interact with people who feed off of this. In Web3, literally everything is open source from the ground up in most cases, and it's incorporated in every aspect. And if you're talking about the forks and abandonment, it actually has direct economic impacts and consequences in Web3. And open source health is actually ecosystem health. It's existential. So that's kind of, I just wanted to give context as the differences between Web 2 and Web 3. in that regard. And when I was mentioning the big picture about how it's governing nations, I wasn't kidding. Like Cardano is the example. We have a constitution. There is a treasury that's paid for by taxes on transactions on the chain. There's an elected senate, i.e., D reps or designated representatives, which if you hold ADA, you can delegate the it's one ADA, one vote, and you can delegate how much is in your wallet to a person that represents your ideals, and they vote on different proposals and things that happen. And the liquid democracy model means there's a computation time before things get reflected back on the ledger. And if someone votes and you don't like how your representative vote, you can actually change it before the timeline ends to switch your vote. And it's very liquid, as in things can change any minute. And so that's what we mean by digital nations. And open source is the public infrastructure of that nation. So we're talking about building blocks where you have the nodes that actually computate and handle all the transactions that go through the wallets of people in the nation, of how they actually accrue their currency and spend it. Software development kits for projects that are actually building to take an ecosystem and make impact, i.e., DeFi is one example, decentralized finance, to give access where you can bank the unbanked, water systems, power grids. And so to understand these public things, it's like a highway system in countries. Governments maintain that, because if it was left up to corporate sponsors, corporations that only pay for those highways to go to their end clients, they wouldn't pay for everyone. So open source is that highway that connects everyone together. The guy who's in the mountains can actually go and meet down below. Give me 1 second. I have to confirm that I am still recording. Yes. So, coming back to that, what you need to know when it comes to Web3 ecosystems, there's independent entities, but one shared infrastructure. So you have shared open source infrastructure, which in Cardano is actually the Cardano protocol, and several different people are a part of that. You have validators and node operators, you have independent developers, you have community governance, which is different things, decentralized autonomous organizations or DAOs. They're their own thing. You have foundations that are set up typically at inception for community engagement, regulatory, and stewardship of the core protocol. Then you have the engineering design or organizations that actually built the protocol and continue to enhance the basic infrastructure. And then commercial entities, people who take the protocol and or projects and use it to essentially make money. So you're building a marketplace on top of a financial system, and then you have a governance system on top of all of this. It's a very complicated thing, and basically the token is at the center of this. It's how you are a citizen, it's how you participate, etc. Now, moving from this is where we get into differences now that you have the context, the understanding, and the basic thing. So an OSPO, going back to the main point, is it's a central a department under an organization that typically deals with the open source projects that that company develops. It can be a part of the product ideation piece. It's typically tied into the software development lifecycle in some piece, and it helps manage some external engagement. Now, that was a very successful model and stuff, but when you're talking Web3, there's a bunch of add-ons that get done to this. Now, my experience comes from with Cardano governance. I was part of the team that helped to build a member-based organization similar to Linux Foundation to manage the Cardano protocol. And I was responsible for building out their open source program office. And as we were doing that, we built a proto DOSPO, but we came to realize the difference between OSPO frameworks and the needs of Web3 ecosystems. And a lot of that has to do with the on-chain governance authority, treasury-funded programs, operator replaceability, and ecosystem-wide accountability. These are things that a DOSPO inherently, even though it's not explicit, has to deal with and or manage in some form of capacity. So with us being a member-based organization and stewarding the core protocol, since everyone builds off of us, there is some accountability for making sure that the core protocol is open source friendly and enhancing community contribution to that, but it also goes externally to the next layer of things building onto it. And if you're introducing like an incubation program and or funding from a treasury to help sustain these programs, it becomes a whole nother nuance that it's not just policy, compliance, license governance, and project lifecycle. It's a whole bunch of different things where we are now stewarding a nation. How do you participate in the infrastructure, building a sustainable environment? And because Web3 is native to a lot of the having digital nations with treasuries included in monetary systems, there's a lot of self-sustainability that can be done in these ecosystems. And currently, from my understanding, there hasn't been a common approach. A lot of places just set up foundations, which is probably at least 60% of the setups, where you have an engineering org, or going back to the typical model that I mapped out, that's typically what you find, but there's not a set aside an open source function. Open source is done in different ways, or it's implicit within the foundation, but it's not a direct mandate. It's kind of left to its own devices. And what I'm putting an answer for is an OSPO helps coordinate that and put a central function within the Web 2 world. We need something similar for Web 3, and it does have a lot of benefits to it, but there comes with strings to it too, where you have to map out the different dimensions that a DOSPO has to meet. And that's what I'm calling the governance triangle, which is you need to be neutral, you have to be legitimate, but you also have to execute. And a common example is decentralized autonomous organizations, which for the Web 2 folks listening in, is basically it's a protocol set up where everybody gets a certain amount of token. It's decentralized and everyone votes, and that outcomes of those votes decide what happens. It's high legitimacy because anyone can typically participate. No, it's not a centralization concern, and it's very neutral. But the problem is it's decision only. Execution falls flat sometimes. And it also has its own legal wrappers it has to deal with. And then we come to the corporate OSPO, which is what I've been referring to a lot. It's very much centralized, so it is not neutral. It's somewhat legitimate because it's built on typical frameworks and it has high execution, but that's why it's outside the triangle, because it doesn't meet the fulfillment of all three of these things. And you do have foundations in here. Now, I put foundations in here because I have experience working within one or the member-based org, but it comes with its own risks depending on it. It's very much high execution and does have legitimacy depending on how it's found up, whether it's member-based org or it's just a foundation, it's an open source nonprofit typically. So that gives it a lot of legitimacy. But neutrality is a different thing because it comes up to the structure of how it's set. Typically, there's a governing board, and there is some risk of decentralization even within member-based organizations. And typically engineering orgs and stuff like that, it's who has the skin in the game. A lot of these can turn into pay to play and different things. So what I am extracting from lessons learned is a decentralized open source program office is a separate execution only entity that can be parametered to fall within existing governance structures in ecosystems, but its whole thing is focused on the open source mission, and it is owned by the community and comes with a term and sunset clause. And so it renews its legitimacy based on the community itself and the impact it has towards them. So that's why it balances all three. It's very much focused on trying to be neutral because no one owns it. It's its own entity. It is community owned in that regard. It is legitimate because of that, and it's focused on an explicit executive function mandate. And it's solely focused on execution. So the other thing that ties to this when we're talking open source sustainability, you have execution, but that comes into two parts, the who and the what, or the who and the how, not the what. So the who we just clarified, which is the decentralized open source program office, and now we have the what, how, which is what I'm calling the open maintenance framework, which is how these programs actually run. And what this is intended to do is be a sustainment mechanism, a growth mechanism, and infrastructure. It focuses on a lot of those project needs that you saw on the first slide. So it's going to determine the programs, the funding flows, then the life cycle mechanics that translate the governance decisions in open source stewardship. And the idea behind this is we do have a white paper out on it. It's 70 pages of relevant programs that different ecosystems do. We are building a portable framework that you can take this and run it within your ecosystem, tweaking whatever parameters you need, and it can be a holistic architecture, or some of these programs can be pulled out specifically to certain things. But they are meant to be two halves of the same system. So the DOSPO, typically, because it isn't a influential body in a sense by coordinated design, you could put it into where it owns the open source remit directly. But because it's decentralized, it actually influences through the program that it runs. And if you are part of those programs, you have to fall in lines with the governance mandates, the policy. And typically, like within the Cardano ecosystem, what I'm proposing in the coming days is to set up their own DOSPO where it actually ties into the community governance layer, and it actually gets delegated authority from the government to run these specific programs it asks budget for and to ensure in line with that. But it also gives the governance layer a way to sunset the program if the DOSPO deviates from its defined remit. And it coordinates with different organizations, and it defines the mandate of the OMF programs, and it's accountable to the ecosystem, and it's built to be replaceable. The thing we're trying to fix with the DOSPO idea is it is a solution to advanced ecosystems. It's not a one thing does all. I mean, you could shape it into different things as you need to, but it is designed to sunset at some point. Its mission is to fulfill and build the structures and the dynamics that need to be there, and then to set up an automation system at the end of it to where these things are done with minimal oversight. Now, the OMF, how does it run? Essentially, it executes programs that are defined by the DOSPO or whatever's managing this framework. It disperses typically what I'm calling treasury funds or tax paid things. It can be anything related to the token or a revenue stream that goes towards the public infrastructure. And it ensures that it's meeting both project needs as well as the individuals behind the projects. Because lessons learned from other sustainability programs is when you introduce money into an open source project, the dynamics of the project change also within the team structure between who's getting paid and who's not. And activities become a thing. And I'll get into that and how it affects stuff. But yeah, that's essentially, there's different ways the maintenance framework works, but it hits a bunch of targeted things. And the thing that's different about it is it's not just funding friends per se. It's about trying to target the systematic risk and operational architecture, and scoring the projects that are critical, funding them according to that remit, and then the individuals behind them, and then projects. It tries to find where is your risk or your critical path, ensure that those are secure, and then focus on the outlying layers from that. So when we're coming back into the DOSPO, what I'm trying to build into with the OMF here too is community governance is the high level. Then you have a lot of different domains, and a DOSPO can coordinate each one. I specifically focus on the open source domain because typically the technical and the security domain are defaults in an ecosystem, but a DOSPO can help coordinate with those. So in Cardano, for an example, which is a lot of this is built from, you have an open source domain where Intersect had an open source committee, you had a technical steering committee, and a security council. And there is an open source office function that helped coordinate these things. So building off from that into a more decentralized environment is you can have someone who is an expert in the open source domain, someone who's an expert in the technical domain, and then the security piece. And the DOSPO helps offload execution capacity from them so that these guys can focus on decision making, and the DOSPO can run those things as well, depending on how you define the remit. Now, it also can tailor its programs to incentivize the decisions made on those. But if you're also building it as an separate execution entity and want to give it that executive authority, it can set up councils for these to sub what is lacking in the community governance cycle. Now, the DOSPO itself, it's going to do intake triage, funding coordination, cross-entity alignment, incident response, and reporting. It has bounded authority based on the charter that it agrees to, a time limit mandate, and replaceable design. It takes on all the risk in the sense that its performance dictates whether it gets renewed. Now, the people it benefits is the infrastructure maintainers and the ecosystem projects. They retain autonomy, ownership, and the right to fork at any time. And the two things at the bottom are the enforcement mechanisms for how the DOSPO ensures that projects align with stuff. And then there's the renewable cycle onto whether the project should be, or a DOSPO can be renewed or not. Let me go back to, yes, I'm still here. I don't know why it does this all the time. Anyway, back to our exciting thing. Now I wanted to get into instruments, and this is a key thing that a lot of ecosystems are getting wrong when it comes to open source stewardship. Most funding needs to be lifecycle aligned, and it needs to match project maturity and the impact of a project. And a lot of places get this wrong. And especially when it comes to contracting funding, who don't understand what open source is, a lot of them end up defaulting into the left field, which is delivery-oriented funding, which is you have scoped contracts, there's features docs, and everything's milestone-based. And that's good, that works, but it's only for very early on stuff, exploration growth, and or already existing projects that have kind of matured in a way. But it doesn't solve a lot of what maintenance means in open source and or maturity. And that's where we're bringing in continuity oriented funding, because we had issues from different places or organizations I was working with where it was a translation and miscommunication where the contracting authorities only knew of delivery oriented and they couldn't understand what the continuity aspects of for projects were. And the fact that compensating a maintainer for doing what a maintainer is already doing when they're like, well, we need a milestone to reflect that, it doesn't correlate. You're paying for the availability of this person to be there for the project. And maintenance requires its own definition. So that's where we broke in maturity and maintenance, which is your continuity oriented funding. It needs to be retainers to make sure maintainers are around. Availability and response, and high dependency projects is where this hits. This builds off exactly the example that a lot of open source sustainability people are quoting with Log4j. Log4j, which was a JavaScript logging library that was incorporated in a lot of projects, it got hacked and gave a backdoor access to admin stuff to a lot of things, which became the Log4Shell incident. But it was an open source project that a team of essentially 4 people just did, and then the whole world was mandating that they go fix the project when it was just something they did in their free time. So they didn't get compensated, and everyone was mandating and hurling accusations, being mad at them for a vulnerability that was in it was a consume at risk type of thing. So this is focused on ensuring that these people are actually paid and they're there and they actually have it helps influence them to ensure that they can take care of situations if stuff like that arises, and compensating them for work. Because like musicians, when they release music, they deserve to be compensated for the music that they released and also at the rate of which it's consumed. If you build an open source project and 80% of the world's using it, I do think you should receive some funding for that. And to make sure that you're available. And that's hitting really hard on the individual aspects that is missed on projects. And then we have ecosystem-wide shared infrastructure support. Typically, some of this stuff is funded when it's core protocols, but what's missed is the periphery projects that people use. SDKs is a prime example, where if you're trying to build an application on a protocol, you typically have reference developer tooling or stuff like that, and there's sole companies that do a lot of this, and this is about supporting those specific projects that have the high demand. and those are the public goods that we're also trying to hit with this. So yeah, that's the differentiation I want to get there. But what did I actually learn from trying to build a proto DOSPO and what it actually taught us? And I've kind of put that into 4 points that I learned is that governance legitimacy is the foundation, not the afterthought. If you are working in decentralized ecosystems, how you are perceived and how legitimate you are from that governance triangle determines what output you're able to do. If no one believes in you, you're not going anywhere. And that's basically nothing moves without a clear on-chain mandate. Authority is assumed is authority contested. So you can't just claim you do stuff. You actually need people to believe that you do that and vote and give you that legitimacy. Operational neutrality must be structurally guaranteed. This is a big one because I've even found in foundation models there is centrality concerns or the person with the loudest voice or has the most skin in the game things can be gamified. So if you actually are trying to do an open source initiative, which should be neutral from that standpoint, you need to ensure that it's not owned by a single thing and that it actually has it's connected to the community governance system in and of itself. The other one is contributor pipelines are infrastructure, not events. Hackathons don't build your contributor bases. You actually need mentorship, and like Google Summer of Code does a lot of things right related to this, but one-off events aren't marketing, they're not operations. So you actually need to make sure you actually focus on building contribution ladders and pipelines. And when it comes to the maintainer retainer, there's a 2 aspect to that. I know we had teased here. One is sustaining the people who are there, but also bringing in new talent and giving compensation to this person to maintain and this person to help onboard to a project. And building that resilience layer, that tribal knowledge isn't lost and new perspectives are also gained. And for measureship ecosystem health, not just commit activity, this is something we learned. We partnered with Grimoire Lab, and it gave us a lot of baseline GitHub metrics for how we determine health of projects, but those are very isolated events and we needed a better holistic picture. And we did partner with them on trying to get some more analytics of like the spiderweb tissue of how people interact with each other with contributors on different projects and even ecosystem levels. But if you are funding open source projects, you need to actually look at the program and project and how it also interplays with the ecosystem as a whole, because we are talking a lot of what we call tokenomics and financial risk with these things. That's why this is very much an important thing. So what can our OSPO community borrow from the Web3 base? Because I've been talking about of what a lot of Web3 took from Web2, but what can y'all get from us? And that's that OSPOs can actually function more than just a corporate layer. So governance, authority, accountability, and funding, all the work at ecosystem layer, corporate ownership is not just a prerequisite. So OSPOs can actually function in a more decentralized way, in a sense. You always have executive stakeholders, but you can actually, InnerSource is a great example of this, in a sense. I have teams working on stuff. I know that was built to introduce open source principles to corporate, but there's another aspect of that where you don't have to be a Web3 folk, but teams in more, depending on how wide the organization is, you can work in some of these principles there. Decentralized principles actually do increase a lot of trust with people and how decisions are made. And of course, in corporate environments, you always do need a single decision winner at the end of the day with a RACI, but there's some things that can be taken away. And open participation beats closed pipelines. Contributor systems are built for open participation, and typically they outperform programs over the long run. So don't just leave your open source project. If you have an open source project and it's mostly just your team participating, look at how you're interacting with the outside world. There could be policies or culture environments that you're setting up that actually are discouraging people from being a part of your project, and you're just open source in the sense that your code's on GitHub. There's a lot to evolve from that, and that's more than just a Web3 takeaway. That's everything in general. The other thing is, depending on how you view blockchain, um, and when it comes to transparency and accountability, on-chain governance creates a legitimacy layer. There's different things. One project I really like is Ondamio, which is something OSPO community can adopt. It's a Web3 native project, but works in any environment where your contribution history can actually be accredited with an on-chain governance thing, which makes, like, Credly is a way to look at it for certificate taking. But this is actually on chain, so it can never be deleted. If Credly and or GitHub go down for whatever reason, you lose the merit, quote unquote, that was tracked via GitHub, or the certificates that were on Credly. But with a decentralized system, it can't go out so easy. So you actually get to take this and transfer it. That's the beauty of the Web3 thing, is you own these pieces. And something is, health metrics matter more than activity metrics. I know Chaos and everyone is evangelizing this, but even in the Web3 space, it's even more important. And if we're talking financial Finos, that community, this is very important. I know they take it serious too. It's not just because, especially as we head into the AI world, this is going to matter more, because activity metrics are going to be completely owned by AI at some point. So we actually need to get health metrics, measure the human impact, the project in ecosystem impact, and even your wider community interfaces. There's a lot to take away there. So for those who are interested in this, coming back to the Frontiers Lab, I'm still getting the cadence for this. We just got it approved by the Technical Advisory Committee. But essentially what the lab is going to do is we're going to research in frontier open source ecosystems, research sustainability. That's why it's called a frontier, because it's a new aspect towards this. We want to develop reference models, pilot programs, frameworks, validate DOSPO and OMF across multiple ecosystems. And I want the definition of those to be refined by others' inputs, not just my initial studies with these contributors. And then publish white papers, open, and it's going to be LFDT hosted. So if you want to join as a researcher, practitioner, contribute frameworks, or even your own case studies programs you're running for evaluation, sponsor pilot programs in your ecosystem, or connect with LFDT working groups, please reach out. We do have a LinkedIn page for this, and we are getting the Discord set up, but you can reach out to me at oscowboyc@gmail.com, and I'll figure out how to get you plugged in. But yeah, that's the basis for this whole thing. Anyway, thank y'all. It's good to see everybody. Bye.